When I was 21, I transferred to a college in San Francisco. I checked out a room for rent on Craigslist. It was a really nice 2-bedroom apartment. It was cheap rent and close to campus, so it was the ideal spot. The girl who lived there was 29 and her name was Beth. She was tall and wide, and she had jet black hair and wore pale makeup. She seemed nice, although a little quiet, but she seemed to like me and agreed to let me move in. So far so good. My first night there we went out for pizza, and that's when I could tell that something was a little bit off with her. Throughout dinner, she kept telling me how much I looked like Shia LaBeouf. I didn't know what to say, so I shrugged it off with a thanks. I mean, I look nothing like him, so it just didn't make any sense to me. When we got back home, she asked if I had seen her room yet. I said no, and so she took me to see it. Her walls were covered in posters of Shia LaBeouf. She even had printed out photos of him all over her mirror. She owned all his movies. I didn't know what to make of it. It was kinda creepy. The whole night she had been saying that I look like him, and now it's obvious to me that she's obsessed with the guy. A few weeks passed, and I never really saw her that much. We didn't spend any time together really. She would come home from work and practically run to her room. She would spend the whole night in there. She had this creepy high-pitched giggle, and I would hear her giggling through the walls all night. I wondered what the hell she could possibly be doing. Occasionally, she would come out and talk to me for like 2 minutes, and she would always be slurring her words, so I suspected that she was drinking a lot. Sometimes, she wouldn't say anything, and she would just stand in the hallway and watch me in the living room. I would turn and see her and be surprised and say, "Hello, Beth." And then there would be this long, awkward pause, and she would give out her creepy high-pitched giggle. It was uncomfortable being around her. She gave me the chills. One night, I woke up at around 2 a.m. because I heard what sounded like the front door being unlocked. I came out of my bedroom, and all the lights were off, but I could still see Beth standing at the front door. She had her face against it, and she was turning the lock back and forth over and over again, and every time she turned the bolt, she mumbled my name. Max Baker, Max Baker, Max Baker. Seeing her standing in the dark and mumbling my name really freaked me out. It doesn't help that she kinda looks like a bigger version of the girl from The Ring. I just quietly went back to my room and tried to sleep. One night, I was watching Gladiator and she stumbled out of her room and turned on the living room light, forcing me to pause the movie, which was annoying. She then asked me if I wanted to hear about her ex-boyfriend. It was an easy segue into the topic, but I just said sure and then awkwardly sat back to listen to her. 10 minutes into her story and she was so riled up. She was screaming at the top of her lungs about their breakup. I was worried that the neighbors were going to call the cops, and she wasn't listening to me when I was asking her to lower the volume. Amidst all of her screaming, one thing she said really freaked me out. She was in such a fit and yelled, "I'll slit his fucking throat." That was a big game changer. Suddenly, I had no idea what this girl was capable of. She was practically a stranger, and everything I had seen was becoming alarmingly disturbing. After a few more minutes, she said to me, "Thanks for listening," and then she started doing her giggle. I got out of there pretty fast and went to my room to go to sleep. I had a pretty unsettled feeling about being in the house with her, and what's worse is that there was no lock on my bedroom door. I pushed the edge of my dresser in front of it to act as a little barricade. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my dresser scraping against the floor. Beth was pushing the door open. I turned on my light, shouting at her to stop. I could see her through the opening of the door. She was really drunk and had this insane look in her eyes. I pushed the door closed and yelled at her to go to bed. I could hear her walk back to her room, but I couldn't fall back asleep. The next morning when I went into the hallway, my heart dropped. I saw one of her steak knives was on the floor by my door. I got goosebumps all over my arms, and all I could think about was her saying that she would slit that guy's throat. I confronted her about it, and she said that she didn't remember trying to push my door open. She said she didn't even remember telling me about her ex. I had enough. My lease was month to month, so I found a new spot and moved out. About a month after I moved out, she contacted me. I was at the movies and my phone was off. When I got out, I turned my phone on, and to my shock, I received over 40 text messages that she had sent me over the past 2 hours. They were all just insane texts that ranged from everything between "Hi, how are you" to "I fucking hate you." It was insane. I didn't respond and I never heard from her again. I always wonder if I hadn't set my dresser in front of my door, would she have quietly come into my room and slit my throat? It freaks me out. I'm a 21-year-old man, and this happened to me and my boyfriend in the summer of 2016. A little background. I live in Norway, which is a small and safe country, where usually the creepiest thing to happen to you would be a nasty look from a stranger on the bus. Because of this, I never thought anything creepy would ever happen to me, because, well, it just doesn't happen here. The city I live in is called Hanfoss, which basically translates to Chicken Falls. In the fall of 2015, right around the time that I turned 20, I moved out from my mum's into my first apartment. The apartment was in the basement of a house, and the owner of the house was an older single woman who lived above me, but we did not get along that well. The house was situated at the end of a gravel road in a wooded area with fields around it, about 1 kilometer from the main road. The last part of the road before you get to the house was up on a steep hill. To get to my apartment, you had to walk through the front gate and around the house to get to the basement where I lived. Right outside my door, there was a small porch, which was usually just used if I or any guests wanted to smoke. Because of the house being up on a hill, there was a really steep wooded slope about 5 meters from the entrance. This was also the end of the backyard, so I basically lived right next to the woods. Anyways, here's the story about one of the creepiest things that has ever happened to me and my boyfriend. This all started in May 2016 when my boyfriend Sam moved in. He lived in Oslo and therefore we needed a car to move all his things. His best friend Jessica agreed to help us when she got off work, which meant it was going to be a long night. Around 11:30 PM we left Oslo and started the drive to my place. Because of roadworks, we had to stop for some time and didn't arrive until 1 AM at my place. Because Hanfoss is a small city, it was dead silent when we arrived. We started unloading the car and I grabbed some plastic bags and went around the house. Right as I stepped onto the small porch outside the apartment, I heard a sound from the woods down the steep slope. It was the sound of leaves rustling in a particular rhythm, as if someone was walking in the woods and kicking the leaves when they lifted their feet. I thought this was kind of weird because I knew there wasn't any hiking trail down there or any other reason for someone to be walking there at 1 AM. It was just woods and an empty field. Sam came up behind me and he also stopped, wondering why I was just standing there listening. "Shh, do you hear that? The leaf sounds?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Jessica had also stopped to listen at this moment. "Hear what?" Jessica asked, but before I even had the chance to answer her, Sam told her about the rustling sound. "Yeah, I hear it. What is it?" she asked, but I literally had no idea. We all just brushed it off as some neighbors or kids, even though there wasn't a lot of neighbors that far into the woods. About a week later, at 1 AM, me and Sam sat outside smoking when I again heard the sounds from the woods. We joked about what it could be, because, as I said, we're from Norway, and creepy things just don't happen here. Stupid thinking, I know. We didn't pay much attention to the sounds, and eventually, we went inside. Another week later, same time, we heard the noises again. At this point, I actually pieced together that this happened at the same weekday at the same time, which was kind of strange, and we got a little scared. We joked about it being a killer who lived in an old abandoned house next to us, or some other creep like the ones that we read on Reddit. We laughed and again brushed it off as just some kids or an animal, but still, we were somewhat afraid of what it could be. The next week passed by without any sounds from the woods, and we completely forgot about it until the week after. I didn't want to smoke, so Sam went out on the porch alone. After a few minutes, Sam burst through the door. His eyes were wide and he sounded scared as he whispered, "Quick, I can hear those sounds again." I ran outside and listened from the porch. Sam was right. The sounds were there again, the same rhythm and pace as before, only this time it sounded as if they were closer. I was a little nervous, so I just looked at Sam, who was also just as nervous as me. Still, being so sure of nothing ever happening to us because of our safe country, we walked closer to the slope and shouted, "Ha ha ha ha, very funny. Maybe I should call the police to let them know that someone is creeping around my house." We both just laughed, but then we heard the sounds stopping immediately. Thinking we scared off whoever it was creeping around in the woods, we enjoyed the silence and shouted, "LOL." Right as I had shouted, we heard the sound again, just faster and louder, and this time it sounded as if someone was full on sprinting right towards us from down the steep slope. Just imagine if you have ever tried walking up a steep hill covered in leaves and your feet almost slipping under you because it's so steep. That was the sound we could hear. And at the same time, both Sam and I just turned around and ran as fast as we could inside, cigarettes still in hand, locked the door and turned all the lights off, and then fell onto the floor. I was so scared. "Did you hear that too?" I asked. Sam looked terrified and nodded. "Someone was running towards us?" I asked. He just nodded again. Right as he nodded though, we heard a sound that still gives us both goosebumps to this day. It was the sound of boots walking on the wooden porch. I was so shocked. My mouth was open while holding my breath, scared that whoever was on the other side of the door could hear us. Sam looked at me and pointed to the door in panic, signaling that he also heard it. I lifted my shoulders. I guess it's the international gesture for I don't know. We both just sat there for some time, too scared to move to the living room, when we heard a loud bang on the window next to the door. We both just sat there, trying not to make a sound. Now, the way the house was built was so that the upstairs where the lady lived was at street level, but if you went around the back, it would look like a two-story house, even though my apartment was the basement. So, basically just half of my apartment was the basement, if that makes any sense. The layout of my apartment was that when you entered the apartment, there was a bedroom to your right, a kitchen straight ahead of you. Next to it was a bedroom which was between the kitchen and the living room, which was to your left. The living room was fully underground and just had a small window by the ceiling, and you could just see a flower bed and a bush. But now, we also could see a pair of worn out boots in the dark. I looked at Sam and pointed to the window and whispered, "Hava fen?" Norwegian for, "What the fuck?" Sam didn't say anything and just looked at me, still terrified. I'm not sure if the person outside even knew that we were in the apartments we were, because then he probably would have just sat down to look at us. Maybe he thought that the basement and upstairs were connected and that we ran inside and upstairs, and now the person outside was trying to look inside to see if he could see us. We crawled into the bathroom and locked the door and just sat there. We didn't have our phones, so I'm not sure how long we sat there. We sat there listening, but we couldn't hear anything. After probably half an hour, we crawled to the living room and put the sofa pillows in front of the small window and called my mother to ask what we should do and if we should bother calling the police. Stupid Norwegians, I know, we should have just called them as soon as we got to our phones, but it's just not how we do it over here. And besides, the person was most likely gone by now. My mother was kind of angry that we woke her up at 2 AM, but after we told her what happened, she said it was okay and that we should call the police if we felt it necessary. At the time, we were just really tired and we knew that there was nothing the police could do. I mean, we didn't actually see the face of this person or anything other than his boots. We were actually planning to move anyways because of some disagreements over rent with the lady upstairs, so I didn't ask her if she noticed anything the next day. We moved out a week later. When I was 22, I moved 1,000 miles away from my Midwest home to the beautiful South Hills of Tennessee. I had a new job, new car, and a nice apartment, but didn't know a soul outside of work. If my phone rang, I expected to hear a faraway family member or my long-distance boyfriend still in college. This was a landline, no cell phones yet. Despite being very alone, I was managing well with the excitement of all the new things in my life. I had only lived there about 2 weeks when the unwanted calls started. The first call. A man's friendly voice asked what I was doing. I couldn't place him and thought maybe it was one of my cousins or uncles. I have a huge extended family. I ask his name. He laughs a little and his tone gets dark, a bit angry, and he says,
"You know exactly who this is, darling."
I pause, deciding if this guy simply called the wrong number or is a creep. I choose the former, laugh, and politely tell him that he has the wrong number. He then recites my brand new, unlisted, unpublished phone number and my name. What the fuck? An intense chill races through me. I've only given my new number to my parents, sister, boyfriend, apartment manager, and employer. I'm new to this city and this lovely southern state. He does not like it when I tell him that he called the wrong number and starts yelling at me, then tells me in a much calmer voice the many vulgar things that he's going to do to me. I hang up and brush it off. He calls again around 1 AM. I tell him to fuck himself and hang up. He keeps calling, so I unplug the phone and return to sleep. However, as days go by, the calls continue and escalate. He starts mentioning personal things about me, said that he likes the white kilt on my bed, knew what was in my fridge, that he's allergic to cats, I had one cat, and then asked me if I was in love with Mari. As I listened to his words, I was standing in my kitchen looking at the calendar taped to the fridge. It had Mari written in pink on the 17th with a heart around it. Because Mari is my sister and the 17th is her birthday. I started shaking and crying because suddenly I realized this creep has been in my apartment. I was alone with no friends or family to run to for the night, and it was me versus a creepy mystery man. I didn't sleep much that night. Early the next morning, I talked to the apartment complex manager before heading to work, telling her what happened and that I want the locks changed that day. She gets a weird look on her face and after a long pause, says that she knows who has been in my apartment and that it won't happen again. What? Turns out that she had a creepy, rapey maintenance guy who noticed a young woman moving into an apartment alone and thought it was his new pet. She had the locks changed immediately and promised that she would personally keep the other key. Although the calls stopped, I was paranoid for a year as I came and went from my apartment because I never knew what this guy looked like. I moved out the moment my lease was up. Only after thinking about it years later did I realize that her weird expression likely meant that it had happened before. Plus, she didn't even fire him. I regret not calling the cops. I was young and naive. When I was about 7 years old, I was at a friend's birthday party. We went to the local cinema with a group of 6 other kids, my friend and her mother. I had to go to the bathroom during the movie and I told her mum, assuming that she'd come with me, because even then I knew going places alone as a child could be dangerous. She didn't come with me. I went out to the bathroom alone, and I must mention this was a small local cinema, which was really old and most of the time empty, not like regular theatres that nowadays always have people bustling about. Anyway, on the way to the bathroom, I saw some guy leaning against the sweets and popcorn counter, seemingly with nothing to do. I thought maybe he's just waiting for his kid to come out of the bathroom or something. At this place, the bathroom was one small room that was separated into 2 stalls for men and 2 stalls for women. The guy came in about a minute after me. I could see his shadow under the door of the stall I was in. He was walking back and forth outside it. He shouldn't have been over on the woman's side, and no one else was in the bathroom with us, so I started panicking. I stayed in there for a couple of minutes because I was too scared to go out. He eventually left, so I decided to go back out. When I walked out of the bathroom, he was standing there, blocking the doorway. Standing with his arms and legs spread out like he was ready to grab me and scoop me up. My heart started racing as he was more than twice my size, and I was terrified at this point. I thought fast enough to jump through the gap between his legs. I skidded on the carpet and burned my knees, but got up as fast as I could and ran back to the screen the party was at. I wish it ended here. That night, at home, I remember hiding this baby doll that I had because I thought the guy was going to come for me and I wanted to protect her. My mum noticed me acting weird and asked what was wrong. I blurted out that a man tried to grab me when I was at the cinema. She kind of brushed it off, but I think she was trying to act like nothing was wrong for my sake, though I saw in her eyes that she was worried. Later, I heard her and my dad talking and she came to ask me what the guy looked like. She asked me, "Did he have a black mustache?" He did. "Did he have messy hair?" He did. But how did she know these things? Turns out, he was at our fucking house earlier that day replacing a window and must have heard my mum and me talking about the party. I don't know what he was planning on doing to me if he grabbed me. Kidnap me? Something else? I'm just glad he didn't. Update. I brought this all up with my mum last night. She looked surprised for a moment, like she didn't think that I'd remember this incident after all this time. She seemed uneasy talking about it, but I eventually got it out of her that the guy was never caught. I'll admit, when she said this, I had a moment of this sinking feeling in my chest, but it quickly left when she reassured me that nothing ever happened with that guy after they reported it, at least with me. They never saw or heard from him again. She told me police assumed that he skipped town after he failed to kidnap me out of fear of getting identified. I can't help but feel worried though. Worried that he might have caught another kid, that they might not have been as lucky as me. I really hope the piece of shit was scared out of attempting this again and no kids were harmed. Okay, so I've had quite a few creepy experiences in my life, but this one was especially unsettling. For a bit of background, I was a 24-year-old female, so my now ex-boyfriend used to live with me. We had very different schedules, so I was often getting home from work and was left home alone. Note, I had to take the bus to and from work every night. One night, I was getting off work and was waiting for my bus to take me home. Right off the bat, I noticed a woman staring at me. I tried to pretend that I hadn't noticed her. As soon as the bus came, I jumped on and headed towards the middle of it. I took a mental note of where the creepy lady was sitting, 5 seats behind me. Halfway through the bus ride, I saw the lady move up, so she was only 2 seats away from me. Red flags immediately went off in my head. I looked around as nonchalantly as possible to see if there was anyone else sitting on the bus. Just my luck, there was no one else on the bus. Pretty soon my stop came up, and I stood up to get off. The creepy lady also stood up. Crap, I thought. I quickly pulled my phone out and texted one of my friends where I was. Now, I know it was stupid, but I didn't think to call or text my boyfriend. Once off the bus, I put my phone away. Big mistake. I glanced around and saw the woman starting to follow me. Now, I live about a 7 to 8 minute walk from the bus stop to my house. I picked up my pace. About 5 minutes from my house, I felt a tap on my shoulder. The creepy lady. "Are you Courtney?" she asked. "Yes," I answered shakily. A smile formed on her lips and I noticed something glittering in her hand. I picked up my pace even more and was almost jogging when I heard her call out, "Josh is mine! He is mine!" Josh was my boyfriend. I honestly at the time had no idea what she was talking about. I started to run. I ran all the way back to my house in record time, that crazy lady following me all the way. I got into my house and locked the door just as the lady pulled on the handle. I grabbed my phone and saw 3 missed calls from Josh and 5 texts. He was freaking out, saying how one of his exes was threatening to come after me and that he was coming home from work early. But luckily, just as I finished reading those messages, I saw headlights pull into my driveway and my boyfriend frantically yelling at the woman, telling her to get the hell out or he would call the police. She ended up running into the woods. Later that night, we called the police, but of course, nothing came of it. So, I've been reading through a lot of terrifying stories, and I thought that I should post one that happened to me. This happened to me when I was 13, and I was home alone with my little sister, who was 6 at the time. I was used to being home alone as my mother usually worked at evening shifts at her job. I was just upstairs in my room, on my computer just doing random stuff like talking with my friends, while my little sister was downstairs and watching her cartoons. Suddenly, my sister came upstairs and walked over to me. She pulled up my sleeve trying to pull me downstairs. I wasn't that confused as she usually wanted me to play with her downstairs, but I still decided to ask her what she wanted. "What is it, sis?" She smiled up at me, and the next words that she said will forever be stuck in my mind. "There is a man downstairs, and he wants to come inside." I felt my heart stop, and I quickly told her to stay in my room. She looked confused, but nonetheless, she nodded and went to sit on my bed. I used that chance to go downstairs, and right there, looking at me through the window, was some creepy man who waved at me.
Hey, let me in. I came to check on your electricity.
My mother always told me to never let strangers into our house when somebody was away, and I wasn't about to go against her wishes, especially when there was this creepy guy. He was wearing something that men like that would wear, but when I looked outside, I saw that he had a van, a simple black van, and not what the electricity guy should be driving. I glared at the man and took out my phone, just in case. "I won't let you in. Go away, or I'll call the police." I was sure that he would leave at that point, but he didn't. He just stood there and smiled at me. That smile seemed so wrong in my young mind, and to this day it does.
Just let me in. I want to help. Beautiful.
What kind of worker calls a little child beautiful? I knew there was something horribly wrong, and I stepped away from the door, and I was so glad that at that moment that we had a double lock. Knowing this made me feel a little bit better, but I was still terrified. "No, go away." He started to become irritated, and he just started banging on my door. I was terrified for my life at that point, but also my little sister's. Speaking of her, because of the banging, she came downstairs. I screamed at her to go back to our room and hide, and I could see the fear in her eyes, but again she listened to me and ran and went into my room. Now, our neighbours are drunkards, and our other neighbour was also at work around that time. I knew that because me and my little sister usually spent some time around there, as the lady living there was always very nice to us. The banging constantly got louder, and then the man started screaming things that he wanted to do to me and my little sister. It brought something back onto me. I took out my phone and called the police. I screamed at the man that I was calling the cops. The man's constant banging seemed to slow down a bit at that point, but it still didn't stop. Once the operator picked up, I started to quickly explain my situation, while on the verge of tears. They told me that they would be there in 10 minutes. I nodded, and the man seemed to understand what was going on, and I heard his footsteps fade away. I looked outside my window and saw him speed away in his van. I breathed a sigh of relief and went over to my little sister. She was crying upstairs, and when she saw me, she hugged me tightly. I wiped her tears away and hugged her back. I took her hand and brought her downstairs with me after I told her that everything was fine. The police arrived a few minutes later, and I explained everything to them. I told them what he looks like, and they asked me for my mother's number. I gave it to them, and they spoke to her. She arrived about 15 minutes later. She hugged me and my little sister tightly, and thanked the police, and then they left. My mother started to cry while she continued to hug us tightly. I could see how worried she looked, but she praised me and my little sister for being so smart, and she took a few days off work to spend some time with us, and I felt glad that she let herself relax. That experience was definitely the most terrifying experience that I've ever had, and I'm glad I came out unharmed, as well as my little sister, of course. I can only guess what that freaking creepy man wanted, and I just thank God that we were both fine. This happened about a month ago. It was a Saturday, and Saturday mornings always have the same routine. I would get up, my dad would be either about to leave for work or already gone. My mother would cook me breakfast, then go upstairs to shower. So, as my mother is showering upstairs, I'm downstairs by myself on my phone. After a few minutes of browsing websites, I glance up for whatever reason and see someone in the far end of my backyard. Our backyard is about 30 to 40 feet. This actually happens a lot in my neighborhood with people going in and out of our yard, so I didn't really think much of it and went back down to looking at my phone. However, I realized the guy wasn't moving. He was just standing in my backyard. If that wasn't bad enough, he was looking into our house. I watched him to see what he's doing. Maybe he thought our house was nice. But that was far from the case. As I'm staring at him, and he sees me staring at him, he begins to walk for our door. At first, he was slowly walking, but then he picked up his pace a bit. At this point, all sorts of alarm bells are running in my head, and I decided this creeper didn't have the best intentions. Getting to action, I quickly called my Sheltie into the room, and as soon as he comes in, he spots the man and begins barking his head off. I quickly go to my door, making it look like I'm ready to let my dog after him, and I guess the guy realizes what I had in mind and took off running. My mother came down about 10 minutes later, but I didn't want to freak her out, so I kept the story to myself. The man still hasn't come back around yet, and I'm hoping that it stays that way.